Welcome to the Assessment Accommodations Overview for the IREAD-3 assessment. My name is Allison Trapacanti, and I am the Accessibility and Accommodations Specialist and the IREAD-3 Program Lead with IDOE's Office of Student Assessment. This overview will provide helpful information regarding accommodations for the IREAD-3 assessment, important reminders, and resources for you to access. Today we will cover new and notable accommodations, information about how those accommodations are presented in Indiana IEP, and frequently asked questions about this assessment. IREAD-3 has text-to-speech available as an accommodation for students who have the accommodation indicated within their IEP. Text-to-speech except items testing reading comprehension is the only allowable text-to-speech accommodation for IREAD-3. Students who have text-to-speech except items testing reading comprehension will have just directions read aloud during testing. When checking to make sure that text-to-speech is indicated correctly in TIDE for a student, you should see Yes next to text-to-speech underneath the IREAD-3 embedded accommodations. The first text-to-speech option that is outlined in red on this slide represents text-to-speech except items testing reading comprehension. Students who are deaf or hard of hearing may require the IREAD-3 hard of hearing form. The hard of hearing accommodation removes the requirement for students to answer items measuring phonics standards. This accommodation is available for both online and paper assessments. Before each test window, corporation test coordinators must report to IDOE the STNs of students who require the hard of hearing form and order paper tests during the additional order window if needed. Students must respond to items in all three test segments, including the non-phonics items in Segment 1 to receive a scale score. IREAD-3 Segment 1 consists of some items that measure phonics standards and some items that do not. This screenshot shows TIDE settings for a student whose IEP requires the student be exempt from interacting and responding to Segment 1 items measuring phonics standards. CTCs must check that the hard of hearing flag is set prior to testing to ensure that the student's IREAD-3 assessment is scored correctly. This setting is not editable in TIDE, but rather activated by IDOE based on CTC completion of a special jot form shared ahead of the spring and summer test windows. Schools should contact IDOE before testing begins if they miss the survey submission deadline and need this accommodation set for a student. A student who is deaf or hard of hearing may require the use of a sign language interpreter. A student who requires an interpreter to sign content must have the following daily accommodations selected in Indiana IEP: student-provided access to an interpreter for sign language, and test directions and content signed to the student hard of hearing. Students who require test directions and content signed must have the following assessment accommodation indicated within their IEP: student-provided access to a sign language interpreter for items except items testing reading comprehension via the online test or paper test. This assessment accommodation is now available in Indiana IEP. Students may receive extended time if stated in their formal plan. IREAD-3 must have a time limit for extra time. Students can have time in 1/2, 50% extra time, or double time, 100% extra time. The amount of extra time must be a case conference committee decision documented in the IEP, ILP, Service Plan, CSEP, or Section 504 plan. Permissive mode is a new accommodation for IREAD-3 this year. Permissive mode allows specific supported third-party software to run on student devices. This may be used for students who require language acquisition through motor planning devices. Students who require permissive mode for IREAD-3 must have the accommodations stated in their IEP. When accommodations are missing or do not match what is included in the IEP, first confirm that the current version of the IEP is finalized. TIDE only pulls information from finalized IEPs and will not pull from a proposed IEP. To confirm that the IEP containing the most current accommodation plan is finalized, go to the student history page in Indiana IEP and ensure that the IEP is indicated as dark green, meaning it is finalized, and not indicated as blue, meaning it is still identified as proposed and not accepted. For the current valid IEP, click the Details button. When selecting accommodations in Indiana IEP for IREAD-3, it is important to note that there is not an IREAD-3 option available when selecting the state testing option. IDOE is currently working on making IREAD-3 its own separate state testing option within Indiana IEP. More information regarding selecting accommodations for Grade 2 students is to come. Accommodations for IREAD-3 must be selected in English Language Arts for the current grade. Not all accommodations listed are applicable to IREAD-3. Read-aloud scripts are developed to facilitate a variety of testing accommodations. CTCs are responsible for ensuring test administrators use the appropriate scripts before students begin testing. The IREAD-3 Test Administrator's Manual and secure scripts will become available for schools in the weeks leading up to the spring test window. Schools should contact IDOE with any questions about scripts before testing begins. CTCs must ensure that all test administrators receive the IREAD-3 Secure Segment 1 script, as this is the primary cause for test invalidations. To prepare for testing, schools must ensure that accommodations from the student's formal education plan are correctly reflected in Cambium's Testing Information Distribution Engine, otherwise known as TIDE, before testing begins. If the accommodations in TIDE match those in the student's formal plan, the test administrator should approve the student to access the IREAD-3 assessment. If the accommodations in TIDE do not match those in the student's formal plan, the test administrator should not approve the student to access the online test. The teacher of record should review information in Indiana IEP, making any necessary updates with parent permission after consulting the case conference committee. The school test coordinator and test administrator should confirm the student's correct settings in TIDE once updates are made and then administer the test to the student. Updating accommodations once testing begins can impact test eligibility, which can result in invalidation of one or more tests. Annual case reviews, ACRs, held during the testing window could jeopardize new accommodations not being entered into the TIDE system. Schools should also ensure that students have opportunities to engage with state assessment accommodations prior to the assessment so that any changes to accommodations are made before the student begins testing. Schools should take into account that a case conference committee meeting is required for a transfer student to occur within 10 instructional days of the enrollment date. This is also true for students who enroll in your school during an active test window. This meeting could also occur prior to the 10th instructional day. Ensuring test participation of any transfer student is also reinforced in the IREAD-3 Test Coordinator's Manual, which reminds schools to report newly enrolled students and/or update accommodations as needed and in a timely manner. Since student participation is required for all accredited public and non-public schools by state law, it is important that students are able to participate in IREAD-3 to the degree possible once correct accommodations are set in TIDE. Schools are responsible for administering the practice test to students before administering the operational test. The practice test is designed to mirror the operational test experience, giving students a chance to sign into the test, practice using the online tools and accommodations, and navigate the online system. It's also an opportunity for test administrators to practice selecting and approving student tests in the TA interface, assigning designated features, and monitoring students' testing progress. Test administrators and students should also use the practice test opportunity to confirm that accommodations are correctly set prior to the operational test. Test administrators should communicate any missing and/or incorrect accommodations to the school or corporation test coordinator right away, so updates can be made in time for operational testing. Please note that students testing paper and pencil will not have a separate practice test book. These students will complete the small set of practice test items on the pages immediately preceding the operational test. Most test invalidations reported to IDOE each year are related to accommodations given to or withheld from students in error. The following reminders are based on some of the most common issues reported by schools. Ensure only one active record per student exists in Indiana IEP. Confirm student accommodations are correct and tied before testing begins. Administer tests using the correct scripted directions, whether they come from the appropriate test administrator's manual, Secure Segment 1 script, and/or accommodated read-aloud script. Provide any non-embedded accommodations locally, such as additional breaks, as prescribed by the student's formal plan. Schools should review the 2022-2023 accessibility and accommodations information for statewide assessments and the 2022-2023 Indiana Assessments Policy Manual for additional details and reminders. The 2022-2023 Indiana Assessment Policy Manual outlines special flexibility and protocols for students and staff who require the use of electronic devices during testing so they can monitor their glucose levels if needed. More details are discussed in the policy manual. The 2022-2023 Accessibility and Accommodations Information for Statewide Assessments details specific protocol for test administrators when administering tests to students with a temporary medical condition, such as a broken arm or concussion. Every fall, Cambium publishes an accommodations training module applicable for all Indiana assessments. This module is designed to provide schools with an in-depth look at the available accommodations and supports available with each assessment and how to manage and review student accommodation settings and TIDE. Please look for this on-demand training module to become available this fall and reference it as needed throughout the school year. Please contact the Indiana Assessment Help Desk with any questions about this module. The Indiana Assessment Policy Manual and the Accessibility and Accommodations Information for Statewide Assessments can be accessed from IDOE's webpage, linked on the next slide. Be sure to review each document ahead of testing, as each is applicable to all Indiana assessments, and let IDOE know if you have any questions. Contact information can be found on this slide. Please direct any assessment accommodation questions to the Office of Student Assessment. Resources pertaining to this assessment can also be found on this slide. You can also access these resources on the IDOE assessment webpage. Thank you for watching the IREAD-3 Assessment Accommodations Overview. Please reach out to the Office of Student Assessment with any questions.